Hey everybody. So I have been working on this video for a very long time. I really didn't know where to start. I really wanted to make it about how Israel has supported the Syrian rebels throughout 12 years of the conflict so far. And I really wanted this video to kind of be a starting place for people who don't exactly understand why Israel is attacking Syria every other week. Maybe you thought the Israeli government just hates Arabs. Maybe you thought it was part of the decades-long civil war. Maybe you thought Israel was provoked by Iran or Hezbollah inside of Syria. None of these analyses would even necessarily be false, but they frame the story within a single dimension, and the Syrian conflict is anything but one-dimensional. Sure, you can frame it as Syrians revolting against the oppressive Assad regime, and many Syrians would prefer that you do that. We prefer that you frame it as an uprising as opposed to a proxy war. Although more actors have entered since the initial 2011 uprisings, a renewed analysis of the conflict, which does not erase Syrians' autonomy, is needed, one which, frankly, many just don't bother to look for. The discourse on Syrians relative to our conflict is usually very limited, and I hope I can help change that even just a little by highlighting Syrians' will and popular perceptions in all of this. As a Damascus-born Syrian, living in a country where I thankfully don't disappear mysteriously for my political activity, I am in a unique position to relay this information to those who are curious and willing to listen. If you find my content helpful, please like, subscribe, share in your family's WhatsApp group chats, your Discord servers, your Instagram stories, your Facebook walls, everywhere. Finally, please consider supporting my channel through a tip or by becoming a patron on Patreon, where I'm posting stuff that may have been taken down on other platforms or has already been taken down on other platforms. I would love to one day make content full time, and funding this passion while improving the content I put out would be of great help. Shameless digital panhandling over. On to the video. To remind us of the humans affected, I want to share some perspectives from those who are native to the area of contention, Quneitra. This land sits at the intersection of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. In the aptly named 1967 Six-Day War, Israel occupied Quneitra and has been building settlements and building civil infrastructure for Israeli settlers ever since. Historically, the region was called Quneitra. However, Golan Heights is the name most commonly used in the West. In order to avoid confusion between the wider region and the city of Quneitra, I will also refer to it from here on out as Golan or Jolan, and use Quneitra to mean the city specifically. Now, it's difficult to draw parallels without offending people, but if you'll bear with me, regions like the Jolan are not unlike Donbass or Jerusalem or Nagorno-Karabakh, the Quebec province of Canada, the cantons of Rojava, which I made a video about you can check out after this, and other zones where there is a mixed society that has its own culture distinct from any of its greater state affiliations. The people of Golan, particularly Arabs but also minorities like the Druze, have always valued their Syrian identity, especially older generations. However, this loyalty is not to Assad, but rather to Syria. That does not mean some are not pro-Assad. Of course, no population is a monolith, and the regime has historically tried to curry favor with bribes to win over hearts and minds and distract from the hell that is the Syrian uncivil administrative state. Israel has also tried to do the same by offering people citizenship. Neither make up for the people of Golan and what they've had to suffer, and, well, I'll just briefly let them explain the rest.
The narrative seems different, but occupation is occupation.
Some people say Israel did not really capture the Golan Heights, but the Syrian regime sold us out. Others say that Israel captured the heights and, in so doing, carried out mass murders and expelled many Druze from their homes. Many people don't know the history and have no idea what is the truth.
The great enemy is the time passing under occupation. As time passes, the issue of Syrian identity becomes less important. Israel uses a divide and conquer tactic between the Druze and the Arabs. The stereotype that the Druze isn't an Arab is false. It is designed solely for division and separation. I am a Syrian and my identity is Syrian.
Over the years, the Golan Heights has become a huge point of contention in Syria. The Syrian people have always allied with Palestinians against Israeli occupation. But what you may not have heard of was that we had an occupation of our own all this time. The first Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, in the late 1970s stated that it is necessary to establish 20 Jewish settlements on the Golan Heights as soon as possible in addition to existing settlements. I think the establishment of new settlements is one of the most successful means that keeps this height under our control. The world would not then expel the Jews from this region. According to historians, between 90,000 and 130,000 people living on the Golan were displaced by the fighting, the vast majority of whom were Sunni Muslims, though some Druze and members of other communities also moved across the border. Israel did not seek to expel the Druze and even allowed some who fled to return in 1969. Throughout its reign, the Assad regime constantly tried to galvanize Syrians' support by claiming it is protecting us from Israel. Some try to claim the 73 war is evidence against this, but it honestly was just saving face. The regime's reputation was at stake, and the narrative could not simply be that we lost at the same time that Baathists took power in 1967. That was not a good look. To control this narrative, it waved the Palestinian flag and used Golan as a way to rally Syrians around the Syrian flag and distract from its own brutality and that of its allies like Iran and its proxies, which I will talk a little bit more about later. However, the events of the 1967 Six-Day War have been shrouded in secrecy, as the regime has an absolute stranglehold on information in the Syrian state. That being said, many Syrians consider it an open secret that Hafiz al-Assad himself sold out the Golan Heights to secure his authority. During the Six-Day War, the infamous Communiqué 66 was announced declaring the fall of Quneitra, the heart of the Golan Heights, and its capture by Israeli forces. However, witnesses say this was premature and that Hafiz al-Assad ordered an evacuation without even putting up a fight against the Israeli army. But regardless of these details, Israel has occupied the Golan Heights since the Assad regime has been in power. No Syrian acknowledges the legitimacy of Assad's alleged concession to Israel. Historically, Syria has never broken the ceasefire agreement written up in 1974, making this the longest standing peace agreement between Israel and any Arab country. While Assad is in office, the Golan is secure. That has never changed since 1967, and Israel has absolutely no interest in regime change or democracy in Syria. Mostly because Syrians would likely elect someone who, I don't know, would rip up the agreement between Israel and the Assads. Israel does not care about Assad's countless atrocities against his own people. So long as their precious Golan is spared, he is all right in their book. This also means that throughout the conflict, relative to the rest of Syria, the Golan has remained mostly peaceful as a result. However, this characterization is not exactly fair to locals, who respond with this.
It's a false and mistaken thought to say that Israel has protected the Golan residents and spared us from the war. I find that to be a disgustingly Orientalist attitude, and to think what would have happened to the Golan had it been under Assad's rule during the war. The fact that there's no daily conflict with the Israeli army doesn't mean the situation is good. Syria is a wounded, bleeding country. That we didn't experience the war in Syria doesn't mean Israel should be thanked. Our lives are like those of prisoners in a cage. We're cut off. We don't know what will happen to us, and we're deprived of any freedom of choice. To sugarcoat the tragic reality is unfair to us. Our reality is more tragic than they think in Israel, and exploiting the war in Syria to undermine the national identity of the Golan residents is wrong and even violent in my view.
Yusri Hazran, a historian and senior lecturer at Shalem College in Jerusalem, who has researched trends and changes in Druze society in the Golan Heights, says,
There are almost no Druze students traveling to Syria to study, despite their far-reaching benefits such as automatic acceptance to certain disciplines without taking an entry exam and exemption from tuition. The collapse of the Syrian state and the devastation there forced the Golan Druze to choose the rational option, integrate into the Israeli sphere. It's a practical integration. I can sum it up in 4 words: recognizing reality, not Zionism. I have never felt any kind of affinity to either Syria or Israel.
the later Ottoman period represented a relatively tolerated Ottoman cosmopolitanism, especially in Damascus and Aleppo, the two main epicenters of Jewish life in Syria. You might be surprised to hear Jews only really had historical issues with Christians during this period, especially in Damascus. Some of it was religious, like blood libel in the 1940s, leading to Christian attacks on Jews in Damascus. A priest accused Jews of using a priest's blood to make matzo. However, most disputes were primarily economically motivated. Jews were heavily favored tax farmers by Ottomans, which led to constant tensions with Christians. The Farhi family from Damascus, a big tax farming family, were even brought in by the Neo-Mamluks from Palestine to solve Syrian economic issues. Syrian Jews were mainly made up of Sephardi Jews who came from Spain post-1492 and the local pre-existing Musta'arabi Jews. Differences between the Shami versus Halabi, aka Damascus versus Aleppo, Jewish communities also arose. All of this to say, there is a wide history of Syrian Jews, a community that is woven into the fabric of history of Syrian society today, and cannot be characterized only by post-1947 events. After the aforementioned 1840s blood libel incident, the only major attacks against this community would come after 1947 partition plan. Those attacks led to what is called the December Pogrom in Syria. The government intentionally fomented violence against the local Jewish community, which had become easy targets to distract from a failing and oppressive government. After 1948, the life of Syrian Jews and Jews worldwide, especially in predominantly Arab and Muslim countries, reached a breaking point. There were around 15,000 Jews in Syria in 1947, but after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, surveillance, freezing of bank accounts, and a ban on legal immigration for Jews were introduced into Syria. In 1954, the Syrian government temporarily lifted the ban on Jewish immigration, allowing many of them to flee. Of course, the condition was that they would not go to settle in Israeli-occupied Palestine. While many managed to be smuggled to do so, other members of the Syrian Jewish community settled in areas in the West like New York. Consequently, the Eli Cohen spy affair in 1965 and the Six-Day War in 1967 paved the way for renewed political hostility towards Syrian Jews and tangled their social relations deeper into a state of despair. The Ba'athist Party and Hafiz al-Assad's rule didn't make things any better, since the 1974 Yom Kippur War mentioned previously was part of his so-called corrective movement. After that, the Jewish community became more isolated and more restrictions were imposed. They weren't allowed to buy or sell property from 1970 until 1980. Their schools were confiscated and they could no longer teach Hebrew. They weren't allowed to go out of their neighborhood without a permit, and their ID cards were marked red and had the word Musawi written on it, meaning the people of Moses. However, in 1975, Hafiz al-Assad granted the return of any Jewish citizen who had fled the country prior to 1948, except of course for those who had settled in Israel. Hafiz al-Assad also hosted a Nazi refugee, Alwa Burner, and assigned him as the government's security advisor. Alwa, the right-hand man of Adolf Eichmann, the architect of Hitler's final solution, helped Assad develop methods of torture and build the prison and torture complex currently in Syria today. As a consequence of these policies and anti-Semitic actions, the fabric of the Syrian Jewish community was now shattered. Many Jews wanted to leave, and some tried to hide their identity and remain anonymous because of the social situation that has been exacerbated. Getting smuggled or fleeing out of Syria was very dangerous. If they were discovered, the Syrian secret police would have imprisoned them on suspicion of violating travel and immigration laws. Some would get the usual Assad treatment, getting detained and tortured, and others would die on their way there. In 1974, 4 Jewish girls were raped, murdered, and mutilated after attempting to flee to Israel. By the 1980s, there were no more than 1,400 Jews left in Syria. Rallies and protests took place over the years in the US and Israel, pleading to let the Syrian Jews out. And after years of pressure from Washington and world organizations, Hafez finally capitulated, lifting the immigration ban in 1992. By then, the ban had been in place for 40 years. The 1990s saw the last biggest Jewish exodus from Syria to the US and Israel. Today, only a handful of Jews are left in Syria. Though Bashar has allowed for some Syrian Jews to visit Syria from the US in an effort to whitewash his actions and seem like an innocent, secular, progressive leader who was unfairly targeted by Western powers who want to replace him with head-chopping jihadi Islamists. Today, Syrian Jews, just like any other minority Syrian religious and/or ethnic group, are looked at as mere pawns to be used and exploited for the Assad's regime's political power and PR image. Peace talks with Israel were another way to save face for the Assad regime. Bashar al-Assad was seen as a potential reformer and savvy politician at the time after Hafez al-Assad died, seizing on this perception, and much like Assad's current approach with Turkey, which I've also made a video about and you can check it out, he used the talks to make some ridiculous demands, thereby proving he was clearly never serious. Now you could be wondering, given that Israel is only concerned about the Golan Heights, why does it attack other parts of Syria? And if Israel supports Assad, why would they fund his opposition? And why do you look like Mr. Bean's son? All very good questions. Well, as I mentioned previously, Assad is not brutalizing Syrians on his own. Without the help of Iran, its foreign Shiite militias like Hezbollah, and Russian mercenaries and jets, he would never have been able to push back his own people. Israel and Russia get along in Syria and even coordinate too. Israel and Iran, although allied in the 80s, have been in a Cold War for decades. If you ask your Arab uncle, he might tell you this proxy war is feigned and that Shiites and Jews are actually at war with Sunnis. This actually isn't an unpopular view in Arab discourse. However, there isn't substantial proof for any cooperation between Israel and Iran. The best I can point to is Iran's history of harboring Sunni Islamists, and the way that Israel tried to portray as Assad being preferable to these Sunni Islamists. Israel started the conflict in Syria claiming it is neutral of the outcome. However, after a few years, US apathy towards growing Iranian encroachment and occupation in Syria led to Israel's active involvement. It's important to remember Israel could easily drone Assad. However, it considers his government preferable to Islamists or an actually democratic Syrian state, as I mentioned before, which would elect somebody who is obviously anti-Israel, unlike Assad. This is why it has mainly stayed out of the conflict in Syria, allowing Gulf states and the USA to do most of their dirty work of destabilizing Syria and weakening Iran. However, after Obama agreed with Putin to pursue deconfliction and coordination, while signing the nuclear deal with Iran, practically handing them Syria and Iraq as a bargaining tool in exchange, Israel, specifically Netanyahu, became far more brazen in their intervention. And by the way, this was literally the end of the Timber Sycamore quote-unquote regime change project. Stop bringing this up as if it's some sort of evidence that Assad is continuing to be targeted for regime change. He is not. It began with Operation Good Neighbor. This consisted of mostly humanitarian aid in the form of food supplies and in some cases medical treatment. Assadists were quick to pounce on this as an example of coordination between Israel and Islamist quote-unquote rebel forces, which is not exactly a strong argument. You may know of the responsibility to protect. Yeah, medical workers aren't exactly allowed to discriminate. Now I know Israel isn't exactly famous for caring about Arab lives, let alone the lives of literal Sunni Islamist Arab fighters, which in another context like Gaza, it would absolutely label as terrorists. However, it's also famous for sowing discord by equipping and allying both sides of a conflict, and generally muddying the waters in order to keep its enemies divided. Just see the Hamas-PLO conflict. Operation House of Cards, Israel primarily funded quote-unquote rebel groups in southern Syria against ISIS and Iran-backed militants like Hezbollah with no evidence of any support for fighting Assad's forces. Even then, Israel's support wasn't sufficient to control the region. The entire operation came to an end in 2018. This is because Trump was now in power, meaning Israel suddenly had way more leeway to act outside of international norms. The Operation House of Cards was now coming to a close. Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal, and the US and Israel were now entering into direct combat with Iran in Syria. Now you may notice Israel and Iran, despite talking a big game, never actually directly attack each other's countries. Most of their conflicts usually come about in Syria. Iran uses proxies like the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the PMF in Iraq, but will never put its own homeland at stake. For Iran, Assad represents Syria. Syria, being their so-called 35th province, cannot be undermined by outside influence. To Iran, this means that Assad must be protected at all costs and his regime must survive. For the West, it appears that never mind Assad murdering his own civilians, it's only his harboring of Iranian weapons in Syria that bring him in their crosshairs. Without even caring about the terror that Assad's army, along with Iran's Shiite militias, have wrought upon Syrians, US presence and Israeli attacks are now often justified under the pretext of Iranian activity in the region, with the addition of fighting any remnant of ISIS. Why are you only concerned about Israeli airstrikes against militants rather than civilian deaths at the hands of Assad, Russia, and Iran in the first place? Why is Syrian and Syrian-Palestinian blood, for that matter, so easy to spill, but not Israeli? How would you react if massacres that took place by Assad had actually taken place in Israel by Israel? If you don't believe Assad is Israel's favorite Arab dictator, why do you think they would be so flippant about their support for rebels? How come they have never supported rebels except besides their own border and only against non-Assad targets? You know Israel funded Hamas to oppose the secular PLO and make Palestinian resistance less palatable to the Western world, right? So would you call Hamas an Israeli ally? Fatah also works closely with Israel. There are also 2 million Palestinians living within 1948 borders who hold an Israeli citizenship. Are they all collaborators? Do you blame them? Do you? Let me know in the comments because my opinion really doesn't matter. You should remember, I am a mere peasant. I am just another Syrian among 12 million to have been lucky enough to flee. I want to represent us in a way that is humanizing. I hope I've done that for you in this video. Thank you for your time. Please remember to like and subscribe. God bless. Salam, shalom, peace.